Hello everyone, welcome to session 2 of LTEC 620 Visual Design. In this video, we're going to recap some of the big ideas that we've covered so far. After that, we're going to delve a bit into the fascinating territory of human visual perception. We'll close out our session today by making a few connections between important concepts. So let's get started. Last week, we emphasized the importance of drawing on both visual design and visual literacy in our attempt to address two overarching questions. One, how do people learn from visual representations? And two, how can learning from visual representations be supported? My hope is that you realize that the readings from session 1 spoke to two different sides of this Venn diagram. So let's start with Callow's dimensions of viewing. Callow helped us understand that there are various approaches to analyzing and thinking about images and visual culture. Drawing on the work of Barnard, Callow argued that all analytical approaches fall on a continuum, anchored by the structuralist tradition on one end and the hermeneutic tradition on the other. Now, some of you may be wondering, what the heck does all of this mean? Well, don't let the fancy vocabulary fool you. The concepts are simple. It's all about how we know what we know and where we derive meaning. On the one hand, we have the structuralist tradition. Analytical approaches from this tradition emphasize the importance of existing systems and patterns. Individual interpretation of, say, a picture doesn't really matter much in this tradition. What does matter, on the other hand, is one's ability to look at a picture and situate it within cultural and social constructs. In other words, an individual's unique perspective and interpretation doesn't matter as much. What does matter is how an artifact represents or fits into a given set of norms. On the other side of the continuum, we have the hermeneutic tradition. This analytical approach is all about the individual. An individual's unique interpretation is really what matters. As a viewer, the desires, beliefs, and values that you bring to a visual artifact is of utmost importance and should come first. In short, in this tradition, meaning is the business of individuals as opposed to culture or society. The point is that both ways of analyzing visual content are important. Learners should be able to value their own individual preferences and reactions, as well as apply social and cultural interpretations to a given visual representation. An individual who is visually literate should be able to draw on both traditions while recognizing their relative strengths and weaknesses. At this point, Callow introduces us to his three-dimensional model of image analysis. He argues that if we really want to prepare students to live in a visual society, they're going to need to be able to analyze visual content from three perspectives: the affective, the compositional, and the critical. According to Callow, the affective acknowledges the individual's role. It includes the sensual and immediate response an individual might have when viewing an image. This dimension also involves aesthetic appreciation and values creative choices in both the viewing and the creating of images. The second dimension is the compositional one. The compositional dimension emphasizes composition, including semiotic, structural, and contextual elements. This approach understands how elements and signs are put together to create meaning. It also considers social situations, cultural contexts, and formal stylistic and artistic elements in order to bring about understanding of a given image. The third and final dimension is the critical. This perspective acknowledges the importance of socio-critical critique. It views all images as entirely in the realm of ideology. In other words, it supports socially just and equitable approaches to understanding images. For example, the critical perspective might ask, who has the power to create this image, or who is represented or not represented by a particular image? Stepping back, what Callow is advocating is that we give learners opportunities to engage in all three dimensions of visual analysis. He argues that by engaging with broader concepts of visuality, the possibilities for a more enriching understanding of images becomes apparent. Of course, in LTEC 620, we practiced applying these three dimensions of analysis to various drugstore products. Callow believes that by switching between these dimensions, we can offer not only multiple perspectives on images at a theoretical level, but also at a pedagogical level, where educators might provide multiple pathways into positive learning experiences. Now, we didn't just read Callow. We also read Hashimoto's first chapter on design elements. In this reading, we learned about the building blocks of visual design. We learned that anything visual is made of these various elements of design. Interestingly, Hashimoto compares elements of design to the notes of a musician or the words of a writer. He also reinforces the idea that the main objective of a graphic designer is to communicate visual information in a unique and efficient way. This should remind us that design, the activity, is always done with intention. So now that we've reviewed a few important ideas from the readings, let's learn a bit about the basics of human visual perception. We can begin this section with two basic questions. How does visual information from the outside world get into the brain? And secondly, how does the brain make sense of this visual information? Well, the answer to these questions are complex and are really beyond the scope of what we can cover in LTEC 620. In fact, people spend entire careers studying minute aspects of human sensation and perception and vision from various perspectives, including physiological, psychological, and theoretical perspectives. For our purposes, we'll focus on the basics. The short answer to the question of how does visual information from the outside world get into the brain is that we look with our eyes, but we see with the brain. So what does that mean? Well, as shown in this graphic, there is a multiple phase process that unfolds in order for visual information from the outside world to get into our brains. The first phase of this process involves our sensory receptors in our eyes, which detect some sort of physical stimulation, in this case light waves. As you probably know, the receptors in our eyes are sensitive to only a tiny portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. Next in the process, these light waves are transduced or transformed from one form to another by the eye. The output is electrochemical signals or neural activity, which is actually the language of the brain. In the third phase, this neural activity travels to the visual cortex, an important part of the brain where the information becomes sensations of color, brightness, form, and movement. The visual cortex is fascinating because it manages to take the two-dimensional patterns from each eye and assemble them into our three-dimensional world. In the fourth phase, the visual cortex combines these visual sensations with memories, motives, emotions, and other bodily sensations to create a representation of the visual world that supports our current concerns and interests. So this four-phase process gives us some simplistic overview of how visual information gets into the brain. But our second question asks, how do our brains make sense of this information? Well, over the decades, there have been different theories about human visual processing works. Historically, there have been 2 points of view, the bottom-up theory of visual processing and the top-down theory of visual processing. According to bottom-up theories of visual processing, perception starts with sensory input. In other words, what is seen is based only on the physical energy received by our sense organs. Bottom-up theories have been described as data-driven, with the data that's actually doing the driving being the sensory information coming in through the eyes. Importantly, according to bottom-up theories, a perceiver's expectations and previous knowledge do not alter information available in the stimulus itself. One of the biggest proponents of bottom-up theories of visual processing was Gibson's ecological theory. Gibson suggested that perception involves innate mechanisms that require no learning. In other words, Gibson argued that sensation is perception. What you see is what you get. He also argued that there's no need for processing or interpretation. The information received about size, shape, and distance, for example, is sufficiently detailed to interact with the environment. In contrast to bottom-up theories of visual processing, we have top-down theories of visual processing. In top-down theories, processing is based on prior knowledge. And importantly, humans use context and pattern recognition to perceive more than is actually contained in the stimulus data. Brunner in 1973 acknowledged the pivotal role of inference in cognition. He argued that we go beyond the information given in our mental processes, and that we learn to add assumptions and supplement information to the evidence that comes to us through our senses. Gregory was one of the big proponents of top-down processing theory, and he argued that perception is a constructive process relying on top-down processing. He also viewed stimulus information from the environment as frequently ambiguous, and he suggested that humans require higher cognitive information from past experience or stored knowledge in order to make inferences about what is perceived. Today, most researchers believe that complex visual processing involves both bottom-up and top-down processes. To illustrate this more concretely, let's take a look at a famous experiment conducted by the famous Russian psychologist Alfred Yarbus in the 1970s. To appreciate his work, take a moment to study this famous painting titled An Unexpected Visitor by Ilya Repin. In his experiment, Yarbus created two scenarios. In the first scenario, he asked participants to examine the paintings freely. In the second scenario, he asked the participants to assess the age of the characters in the painting. Now, as you can see from the eye tracking results, the task, whether to look around freely or to assess the age of the people in the paintings, significantly altered how people viewed the painting. Yarbus argued that this was evidence that both bottom-up and top-down processing exist. In the first scenario, the painting itself drives what participants view. However, in the second scenario, the task, or the need to determine the age of the characters, drove the task in a top-down manner. Now I want to share one more interesting study with you that has to do with the realm of visual perception. This was early work done by Charles Osgood, a psychologist at the University of Illinois working in the 1950s. In his book, Osgood and colleagues explained his interest in trying to find out what descriptive terms people use most frequently when evaluating stimuli. In other words, how do people evaluate something they've never seen before? For his experiment, he showed participants different visual stimuli, and he asked them to rate the objects using various descriptive continuums, such as pleasant, unpleasant, smooth, rough, low, high, slow, fast. What he wanted to know is what were the most important features people paid attention to when analyzing visual stimuli. The findings of his study are absolutely fascinating. In fact, he found that there are three factors that people care about the most when evaluating something they haven't seen before. These factors include evaluation, potency, and activity. In other words, is the object being viewed good or bad? Is the object weak or strong? And is the object passive or aggressive? Of course, it is easy to imagine that early humans out on the savannah struggling to stay alive in the elements had an advantage if they could quickly discern if something was good or bad, weak or strong, or passive and aggressive. The ability to ascertain this information quickly was almost certainly an important aspect of staying alive. It is easy to see how this connects to our fight or flight instinct. If something is bad, strong, and aggressive, then surely it makes more sense to run away than to fight. You might be asking yourself, how is this relevant to today? Well, think about all of the advertisements we see on television, in magazines, and in newspapers. The designers of those advertisements know about studies like Osgood's. And they want their products to make good first impressions. So they design those products in a way that speaks to people quickly. Think about some of the recent anti-smoking campaigns that have been designed to be deliberately graphic in nature. Those campaigns are designed to be aggressive, strong, and leave a bad impression so that children don't start to smoke. Well, we're just about out of time for today, so I want to end by emphasizing a couple of connections. I hope you see how visual designers can leverage bottom-up and top-down theories of visual processing to design more effective and efficient artifacts. I also hope you see how learning about the elements of design and the various dimensions of image analysis are preparing us to address two overarching questions of the course. How do people learn from visual representations, and how can learning from visual representations be supported? With that, I'll close by stating that over the rest of this semester, we'll be adding more and more knowledge and skills related to the intersection of visual design and visual literacy. In short, we have a lot to look forward to. Okay, that's all for now. Have a great week and see you online.